Hey team, it's Ben. How are you doing? It's time to go a mile deep, and today we're going to be going a mile deep on the inner critic. Now, this is going to form the overview as part of a series I'm doing on the inner critic in my school page. Now, one of the things that I'd love you to do if you're listening to this podcast is head on over to the link in the comments, which has got my link to my free school. And I'm going to be doing a series on the inner critic in my school to share with people about how your inner critic forms part of the obstacles part of the 10x process. Now, if you've listened to this podcast for more than 2 minutes, you'll know that there's 5 steps in the 10x process. And the second one is obstacles. And one of the biggest obstacles that I see entrepreneurs, leaders, people who want to put themselves out there in the world have is this inner obstacle of, I termed it part X the other day, but there's also this really, really clear part of us all, which is called the inner critic. Now, the reason I wanted to do this is that I had a week where there was a number of clients that I was talking to, and I was hearing very, very clearly that their inner critic was really holding them back. Now, there's a number of ways where your inner critic can hold you back from going 10x. And one of the biggest ones is that you want things to be so perfect. You want things to be so goddamn polished that you don't take action because you're so worried that when you do take action and you make a mistake or you fail, you have the inevitable mistakes of success, that you're going to get such a barrage of abuse from yourself. Now, this is what I think is a big, big problem for so many leaders and entrepreneurs. Is like one of the things that has got them to where they are now, at some point they've had this critic. And whether that's been an external source or it's morphed from all of the experiences that they've had throughout their life, that it's proven to be a very great motivator for success and perfection and high-level performance. And albeit that might have been what got you here, it won't get you there. Because surefire, it will be the thing that burns you out or makes you feel so toxic and shameful and contracted in the long term. It's not a long-term motivational force. Like I talk about this idea that love is the best motivational force in the universe. It's the best way to lead and to build businesses and relationships. Whereas criticism and harshness is not the way to do it in the long term. On occasion, it's going to serve a purpose. But at the same time, there's nothing that harshness and criticism that can do that love and appreciation and directness can't do better. Can't do and do better. Okay, so that's like a really important point as we talk about the inner critic. And what I want to do in this podcast is just give an overview of what I'm going to be covering in the inner critic mini-series, because what I found is that there's so many shades to this, so many parts to this conversation. And I think that you have to understand it first. And I think I like the term psychoeducation, where you're learning about the psychology behind the experiences you're having, so that when you come to experience it, you can spot and you can label it and you can say, that's this thing, that's part X, or that's the inner critic, that's the things that I'm experiencing. So that's what happened for me. I was like, right, well, that's my inner critic, and actually that's come from this person. And so what I want to share with you on this podcast is how the inner critic might be showing up in your life and where it's come from. And the first one, and the first waypoint on your journey is to understand where your inner critic has come from. So that's the first thing you need to understand, where it's come from, because there's so many places it can come from. And if I look back in my past, I had a very supportive mother and a very supportive father. Both of them very rarely criticized me heavily. And when I did get criticism, I knew that I'd done something majorly wrong. And the way that they did that was amazing. My dad was really supportive, but when I put my foot out of line, he'd be like, come on, Ben, you're better than this. He would always call me up, not call me out. But I still have an inner critic. But listening to clients over the last couple of weeks, I'm like, that's not their voice. That's come from somewhere else. And so what I'm going to do in the mini-series is I'm going to give you, I think around about 8 places that it can come from. And so what that'll help you do is it'll start to help you, I think like name it to tame it, start to see it so you can spot it, and then you can morph it into something that's much more positive and much more service based, that's going to help drive you forward so you can actually have a conversation with it. The second point is that you actually understand what happens when you leave your inner critic unchecked. Now, the problem being that most people will leave their inner critic unchecked for their whole entire life. And you may have seen this person. It might be your mother, your father. Likely that's the place you see it most because you know them intimately. That may have that colleague in work. And if you're listening to this and you know that you've got that friend who's constantly criticizing themselves, send them this podcast. It's like if you leave your inner critic unchecked, it can floor you, it can flatten you, it can hold you back from what you're truly capable of. And it's so easy to change. And then this is the best thing. This is the great part about inner critic work, is that I've done lots of inner critic work with clients, and it's like when you see the lights go off, like the lights come on, sorry. When you see the lights come on, it's like, oh my gosh, that's not even my voice. Oh, that's where it's come from. Oh my gosh. What I can have a conversation with the inner critic. I can actually say, that's not helpful, shut up. And I have a conversation myself. And that's one of the things that they get so much value from, is that when you learn what happens when you leave it unchecked, you actually realize, oh my gosh, I've been experiencing this for so long. So what we're going to dive into is like really the symptoms of what's going to happen to you if you don't start to have a better dialogue with it. And this is huge. This is so big, because I actually, having watched people exponentially shift their life and the way that they spoke to each other, to themselves, the way they spoke to their partner, their kids, because they've got a handle on this. It's been a big part of the work that I've done with clients, and that's sometimes one of the biggest things I get feedback from when I speak with a client after their journey with me. I'm like, what's some of the biggest shifts you've had? And not all of them will report things like massive financial shifts, because they do have them, but the more valuable one that they'll report is, I just speak to myself so much better. And part of it is the work that I do. Like, I'm very, very kind. I'm very, very open. I'm very, very loving in the way that I coach. And that rubs off on people. That just being around people that speak very kindly, that are very loving towards themselves, who are great leaders and still do that stuff, is really, really helpful. Because I think that there's a real shift in the way that we see leaders these days. Is that the autocratic, direct, harsh, what's the word for it? Really just like overbearing leader who would use criticism and harshness to get people to do things. That's a dying breed. That's in the modern workplace. That's not going to be as effective. But equally, I think the way that Trip Lanier talks about this, it's like the new age wimp versus the macho jerk. You don't want to be too new age wimp either, where you're not powerful in expressing your loving, supporting, kind ways. So I think it's about finding the middle. I was actually going to call this podcast The Mighty Middle, but at the same time, I think this is, a mile deep. We're going to go a mile deep into this. And so it's really important to know is what happens if it's left unchecked, because you really do need to know this. And you might be experiencing this. You'd be like, gee, do you know what? As I'm listening, I really do give myself a really hard time. And I want you to understand the consequences. So in the Inner Critic series, I'm going to get very clear. We're going to go a mile deep on that so that you really understand that. Another thing I want you to understand as well and discover is seeing the critic for what it really is. Now, when I did Part X work with guys for 2-3 years, when they started spotting Part X, they're like, I need to kill it. I need to get rid of it. And I think the same thing happens, is that when we realize, oh my gosh, I've got such a big part of my inner dialogue, which is critical and unkind and harsh and contractive. Oh, I want to kill it off. Now, I'll tell you now, that's not a reality. It's not going to happen. You're not going to be able to do that, so don't even try. It's futile to do that. It's a part of you which has got a purpose. And what we're going to go a mile deep on is understanding that purpose. And when you really understand that, it's a much easier experience to learn to work with your inner critic, to use it as a compass instead of using it as something that's trying to destroy you. And if left unchecked, what I said before, left unchecked, it will destroy you. It will hold you back. It will, Maslow famously said, what one can be, one must be. Now, if we're choosing comfortable decisions so that we don't criticize ourselves, we don't put our head above the parapet, we don't allow ourselves risk, we're never going to be what we can be. And that means that we'll be unhappy for the rest of our life. And that's something that hit a big part of his work, was that if you plan on being anything less than you're capable of being, you'll be unhappy the rest of your life. And if you've got a very vicious inner critic, guess what you're going to do? You're going to hold back. You're not going to take risk. You're not going to push into relationships. When you do make a mistake, it's going to hurt 10 times or 10x more than it would do if you'd learned to ally with your inner critic. Like, I still have an inner critic. I still make mistakes. I remember being sat in traffic in Dubai probably about 3 months ago. I had a workshop that I had left with, I think it was like 2.5 hours to get across the whole of Dubai, which normally takes about 45 minutes. And there was roadworks, like random roadworks. I was stuck in the traffic and there was nothing I could do. And I remember this really critical voice started going, Ben, you freaking idiot. I can't believe this. You've got put all this effort into getting people onto a workshop and then you're not even going to be there. And I heard it. And I was like, oh my God. And I was like, I remember just pausing and thinking, that is just not helpful right now. I'm not engaging in this. I've done my absolute best to make sure that I've left enough time, that I've checked every box, and this is out of my control. And I actually had dialogue, and that showed me how far I'd come with personal inner critic work, because I was dropping into shame. And when you're in shame, especially when you're trying to sort something like that out, your logical, rational mind is almost off the grid. It doesn't work as well. And that's, one of the consequences of leaving this unchecked. If you think about this, is like when you need to be logical and rational to sort things out in your life and you're giving yourself a hard time, you're not. And if you've ever had a disagreement with someone and you've been maybe pushing on them and being nasty to them and being mean to them, watch them drop into this irrational, illogical state where they can't even speak. Well, that's you when you are on the receiving end of your inner critic. So really important, like think about this as a leader. If you're doing this and you are constantly on the receiving end of this barrage of abuse, of self-abuse, imagine that change. Imagine how much of your bandwidth, of your logical, rational thinking would shift. It's absolutely amazing. I've got about 4 or 5 clients at the moment. All of them said that they wanted to work on their inner critic. And that's something that's really prevalent in so much of the work that I do with clients. Is like there'll be a number of things that they come up upon and like, oh my gosh, I never even realized how much of an issue this was until we started delving into it. And on the other side, they're like, oh my gosh, I've spent 10, 15, 20 years struggling with this voice, thinking it was just as it couldn't be changed. And that's the best part. It's so easy to rectify. And I think learning about it and learning about the consequences and how much of an effect it has and where it comes from and how to actually have a dialogue with it is what is so, so powerful. So there's 4 U's that allow your inner critic to run wild. They're leaving it unchecked, uninterrupted, unchallenged, and unsureness. So when we dive into them, you'll start to understand why it shows up in those moments where it's left unchecked. You leave it uninterrupted. It's allowed to just barrage abuse at you. You don't challenge it verbally. You'll actually see me sometimes in my car, especially in my car, challenging some of the narrative in my head. And actually that's a big thing that clients really, really do get a lot of value from, is like, oh, by the way, Ben, I'm speaking out loud to myself way more. And I always see that's a really positive thing. I always remember hearing Tony Robbins talking about how he'd go along the freeway screaming in his car. And I'm like, yeah, that's me in the desert running, or it's me in my car. And it's so powerful. It's so empowering to be able to help yourself like that. And then the last two things is like, who is your inner critic? Like learning who your inner critic was. There's a deep exercise I do with clients, which is really, really helpful to help them work out who it is. And is technically what you're trying to do is you're trying to work out what that person was saying to you at that time, which you interpreted as criticism and shame. And when you can clear it, it's like, actually, they were probably trying to protect you. They might have had their own projections. And when we really get clear on that, when we really delve into that, they're like, oh yeah, it was my high school teacher who just wanted the best for me. You know, I was probably one of mine. I had a teacher called Derek Williams, a phenomenal teacher. And he used to criticize me because he just saw massive potential. And I remember sitting next to him at a rugby game years after, and I had so much respect for him. I was like, even when I was saying his name on the podcast then. And he used to criticize me all the time in class. And I as a younger boy, really struggled with that. I really struggled with that. And I remember we had this altercation, and I got in his office, and he was shouting at me. And I said to him, like, why are you always shouting at me? I was like, why do you always yell at me? And he goes like, and he just went quiet. And he just said to me, because I see so much potential in you. And you never said that before. Like, you never said that. And I remember, like, a big part of my inner critic at that point in my life was him, his voice. And like learning to understand those moments for yourself is so, so powerful. Like, I've done a lot of work to understand who my inner critic people are and how they've morphed together. So when I find myself dropping into criticism, I know where that's coming from. So then I know what conversation to have for that as well. And like, that's been so, so helpful. And the final part is learning to develop a set of tools for what I think Connor Beaton put this really nicely, which is rigorous self-approval. And I love that idea. Is it not self-love, especially for men as well? Like, when you say self-love for men a lot, they don't get that. Self-love is sometimes it's a bit like saying to a guy, be vulnerable. Guys don't identify with the word vulnerable as well as they would say be courageous. Go and have a courageous conversation with that person often means go and be vulnerable, but it's not an attractive thing to do for a man, especially, not for anyone. But what I noticed when we shifted the word vulnerable to courageous for a lot of guys, there was like, oh yeah, I want to go and do that. I want to have that courageous conversation with my partner. But say go and be vulnerable with your partner for guys, and a lot of guys are like, no way. So, and this is what I love about rigorous self-approval. It's self-love. All the things in here are the same things as that you do for self-love. But what I like is it's self-approval. And that's where I'm not trying to externally validate myself. I'm not looking for anyone else's approval. It's rigorous self-approval. I know I'm my word. I know what I put in the calendar gets done. I know I come good on my promises to myself. I know that when things get hard, I show up the way I need to show up. So what I will share with you, especially in the last training, is like how to develop a level of self-approval that when your inner critic shows up, you've just got this absolute arsenal of information and experiences and practices and habits that really help you win the battle against your inner critic every single time. So thank you for listening to today's podcast or watching the video, watching the YouTube video. If you've enjoyed this, please do me a huge favor. Could you review the podcast? Honestly, it means so much to me that you've listened, and it means so much that you'd review it, leave a 5-star review. And if it's anything less than a 5-star, tell me why. Tell me what could make it a 5. But at the same time, share this with someone who's working on their inner critic. Maybe you've got an employee, maybe you've got a leader, a family member who struggles with their inner critic. Well, this podcast has just been an overview of what I'm going to be covering. If you go into the link, I've got a free membership group on School. Really easy to join. It's not complicated at all. And I'm going to be going through what's called the Inner Critic series. I'm going to do 3 mini trainings in there. And then you can also buy a deep dive course on the inner critic. So there's so much value in there for if you're looking to do more work on your inner critic, understand it at the depth, which is going to really help you shift your work and your life. And if you want to go a mile deep, it's definitely the place to go. Thank you so much for watching this video or listening in. We'll see you on the next podcast.